Over the history of Warcraft's most beloved classes, a great deal of buttons and abilities have been removed from the game. This can be due to them no longer serving a purpose, balancing issues, or just flat out giving the Warlock too many buttons to push. And in this list, we're going to be going over some Warlock abilities that were removed from their kit, varying from their iconism and usefulness when they still existed. Starting us off at number 10, we have Thal'kiel's Consumption. This button was added in Legion as the on-use ability for Demonology Warlocks for the artifact weapons. Artifact weapons are essentially infinite scaling weapons that progressively give your character more unique powers and abilities for your class and specialization based on its level. You would level it up through basically any form of content in the Legion expansion and gain its special abilities as you did. Upon retrieving the Demonology weapon, the Skull of Manari, you'd be given the ability from this entry. What it essentially does is upon use, it will drain 8% of the health of all existing demons and deal a large amount of shadow damage to your target based on the health it stole from them. So basically, the more demons the better, and you'd be able to slam a mob for massive chunks if you manage to have a large group of demons out at once during the cooldowns with things like Nether Portal and Dreadstalker summons. This even includes your base summon demons, so regardless, it was stealing health from them and doing damage, even at its lower moments. Funny enough, because the ability actually steals the health of your demons, it could accidentally kill them sometimes because the demons were already too low on HP. This mostly only occurred in PvP, however, because many dungeons and raid encounters don't actually damage a person's pets, especially a Demonology Warlock summons. What makes this ability so favorable, however, is it usually lined up pretty well with the previously mentioned cooldowns. It felt super novel to gather a legion of demons to your side and only to hurl a crackling skull at them, and make their health bar just chunk for a ton. It was eventually removed with the retirement of the artifact weapons in Battle for Azeroth, unfortunately, but it actually somewhat saw a return in some way via the Demonic Tyrant ability. The Tyrant had a similar mythology and talents built around it, and it allowed you to also drain health from your existing demons and then increase its own damage. It was actually the main method of damage for Demo Warlocks for a very long time, and it wasn't until Dragonflight Season 3 that we started to see a shift in more sustained damage for Demo Warlocks rather than massive upfront burst. Either way, thematically, this button was super fun to press, but only lasted an entire expansion. So it was pretty quickly forgotten, and even later in its legacy, its strategy was left behind for being a bit too good, so it's only at number 10.
We're going to freeze to death unless we call for help. How does your phone look?
My phone has just enough power to sign up for Factor. And with how cold it is out here, nothing would be nicer than a warm cooked meal that you can get ready in just 2 minutes.
Thank goodness you have internet. Quick call for help.
Oh, no can do. I'm too busy thinking about which kinds of snack options I'm going to add to my menu, like breakfast, smoothies, juices, small bites, and more to keep me going no matter what's on the schedule.
We are going to freeze to death. We don't have time to look at subscription food services.
Factor takes the stress out of meal planning and sets you up for success. Skip the grocery stores, prep work, and cooking fatigue. Instead, get chef-crafted, dietitian-approved meals delivered right to your door. With over 35 meals to choose from per week, including options like keto, calorie smart, vegan plus veggie, and more.
Wait, really? How exactly does this whole thing work?
Just sign up with me and we'll find out together. We're ghosts, we can't die anyway. Thanks to Factor75 for sponsoring today's video. Use my link and get 50% off your first Factor box and 20% off your next month of orders. And at number 9, we have Deathbolt. Introduced in Battle for Azeroth, this button was exclusive to Affliction Warlocks, but works very similarly to our previous entry, Thal'kiel's Consumption. Essentially what it does is you will spend 3 soul shards to launch a bolt forward on a 1-second cast time that bursts upon impact. The amount of damage it does is actually increased based on the number of dots currently active on the target, and accumulating their damage into the bolt itself. Once it hits the target, it will do 30% of the remaining duration of all your active dots on the target, while keeping the dots themselves active. So, Agony, Corruption, Phantom Singularity, Unstable Affliction, and Vile's Taints damage would be combined basically into a single bolt, and deal 30% of its effect in that cast. It could also critically strike, so just imagine all of your main damage, the dots themselves, actually rolling and then throwing out a Deathbolt, and suddenly, the boss's health in a dungeon just drops because it suddenly took 30% more damage from you. That's essentially what this button did, and it would cause an Affliction Warlock to just randomly become the top DPS at the start of an encounter because they were just ramping all their dots and getting ready to press Deathbolt. Interestingly, you can cast Deathbolt with no dots on the target itself, but it will just deal a single 1 point of damage to the target. Because of this, the way Blizzard designed the ability was to always deal the base duration of a dot's damage when Deathbolt is cast, so things like Absolute Corruption and Summon Dark Lair cannot increase the throughput damage of Deathbolt even further. Now, the reason Deathbolt is at number 9 is it comes from an era where Affliction Warlock was just insanely overpowered. It was so difficult to make this button work for Blizzard that it ended up just getting made into a dumbed down PvP talent for Affliction Warlocks instead. In patch 8.3 BFA, the damage of Deathbolt was lowered to 20% from 30%, and eventually made to deal damage over 3 seconds rather than instantly in Shadowlands for its PvP talent version. Eventually in Dragonflight, this lesser version Deathbolt was removed in 10.1.5 because it never really saw play because it could no longer burst down enemies like it used to, and just show that the only way for it to succeed was in its OP state, which is actually a pretty good analogy for Warlocks as a whole. They've almost always been a good choice for dungeons and raids since the beginning of WoW. So while it may have been fun to just press the button and climb the DPS charts for a fight every 30 seconds, it's mostly just a testament to how hard it is to balance and an issue Warlocks pretty frequently face for the class. And at number 8, we have Unbound Will. This ability was added in Mist of Pandaria with the heavy talent reworks Blizzard introduced for the expansion. Essentially, Blizzard had explained that talent trees were getting too bloated for every class and spec, and adding more abilities and talents would just make it too difficult to balance for everyone involved. Because of this, they decided to introduce a talent tree that unlocks a row of choices at designated levels, and in this row, you would have a selection of abilities pertaining to your class in general rather than your specialization as a whole. To remedy the absolute loss the class may have lost because of this, Blizzard also heavily rework or change classes as a whole to instead work around, which we'll get into a bit later. The point is, the ability was a choice for Warlocks at level 60, shared between Burning Rush and Blood Fear, which both actually still exist in the game. Unbound Will basically would instantly cast itself at a minute-long cooldown and purge yourself of all magic, movement and parrying, and loss of control effects for you and your demon pet. So if there was a magic dispel needed on you during an encounter and the healers couldn't get to you, this button was your go-to. It also cost no mana and instead actually dealt damage to yourself in its place. So for 20% of your health, you could rid yourself of basically the strongest negative effects placed onto your character and heal it off after. It's a pretty common trait amongst Warlocks to damage themselves at the cost of really overpowered spells, and the most unique thing about this button was its ability to remove loss of control effects. In PvP, this is generally translated to a stun of some kind like a Rogue's Blind, for example. It was a heavy sacrifice, but it might just be the answer in a life or death situation when it comes to arenas. It went relatively unchanged all throughout MoP, and it wasn't until the release of Warlords where it instead was reworked to not cost health anymore, but have a 2-minute cooldown instead of 1. This ability is removed altogether and has never seen a return since, but its 2 talent nodes it shared remain. Burning Rush is commonly seen on many Warlocks being basically their only method of movement increase outside Demonic Gateway. This also damages a Warlock when it's cast, but it's a permanent effect to increase your speed as long as you have health to handle its damage. Blood Fear just makes your Fear an instant cast, but instead costs 10% of your health. This also could be cast as much as you wanted as long as you had HP for it, meaning you could fear a mob for quite a long time if a healer is able to back up your sacrificed health. All it does now though, is just fear a target in place rather than cause them to run around in random directions. Basically, the ability to remove such strong negative effects on yourselves was a pretty big godsend for Warlocks in PvP, and the attempts to balance it were all but null, as it was removed entirely in Legion and can only be compared to that of your Imp's Purge magic ability, which is already a rarely used demon summon for Warlocks in general. Up next, we have the Hellfire spell. This spell was added in the original version of Warlocks in Vanilla and actually stayed all the way up until the BFA expansion. It was incredibly simple to use, and all that would happen when you press it is a large radius of fire would surround your character that pulses damage periodically to all enemies within the circle. It would channel for 15 seconds, so casting any other spell or taking damage would cause the ability to push back and effectively reduce the cast time. It already cost a great deal of your mana to cast, so you had to be sure it was something worthy to use in the first place before just pressing it randomly. On top of all of this, the ability also damages you every time it pulses damage, so while you're hitting mobs in the surrounding area and being damaged by them, you're also damaging yourself. It was a pretty high risk, high reward, and if you knew how to live with the damage, you could melt packs reasonably efficiently. In dungeons, it also had high usage because you no longer had to worry about pushback from mobs attacking you, and you could rely on the tank to group the mobs together, go in and press Hellfire and get its full value instead. This especially occurred during Cataclysm Mist of Pandaria because a Warlock could use their offensive cooldowns and then press Hellfire and rise to the top of DPS meters very quickly, depending on the mob density of a pull. It also was very thematically on point with Warlocks, even appearing directly in the original vanilla cinematic trailer Blizzard put out back in the day. Plus, it was one of the very first cards introduced in Hearthstone for the Warlock class, and it worked basically the exact same way. You deal 3 damage to just about everything on the board, including your own minions and yourself. It's just a really core ability to the Warlock kit. and it'd be a shame to not include on this list because of its iconography alone, not even the fact it actually does pretty good damage as well before its eventual removal. It makes sense why it was removed, as it no longer really did anything by the time Legion came out, and it was a demonology only button by this point and didn't actually do anything more since the concept of demo was so far from what it used to be, as discussed in entry number 10. And at number 6, we have Shadowflame. This ability was added for Warlocks and Wrath of the Lich King and also worked incredibly simple like Hellfire. Basically, you'd press it and you'd cast a frontal cone of Shadowflame fire in front of you, instantly striking all targets before you and then leaving a dot effect on the target struck. It's not overly complicated and is mostly kind of just there, but the biggest thing about this ability was the fact that it was uncapped in targets. Before, there were many spells in WoW that would either do reduced damage or simply not hit a target altogether when there were too many mobs in one area. But this was one of the few in the game to just ignore this rule, and instead just hit everything in front of you, effectively making it one of the strongest AoE abilities in the game during its time, as long as you had a crap ton of mobs in front of you. The only kicker was that because it was a frontal cone ability, you actually had to move your character into melee range to use it for it to be useful. But thankfully, this isn't really an issue because you can just cast Shadowflame and then immediately follow with Hellfire from before, creating some pretty awesome interactions of heavy AoE damage per pack, no longer requiring certain cooldowns to really thrive. This eventually was changed in Legion though, because having a caster class need to be in melee range kind of got them killed a lot, so in Legion it basically did the exact same thing as mentioned, but instead launched a Shadowflame bolt forward that dealt its initial damage and applied the dot on impact. At the press of just 2 buttons, you could climb the DPS meters like no one's business and be an effective member of your group. It also just looked cool, sharing a visual similar to that of the mage's dragon breath, but instead was much more violet colored and had a demon's head rather than a dragon's. Sadly, the ability was removed in BFA and hasn't seen the light of day since. And at number 5, we have Life Tap. In the theme of Warlocks hurting themselves for the benefit of other magical things, this entry would be hard to ignore from any veteran Warlock of old. Mana is a pretty scarce resource when it comes to Warlocks and classes as a whole in WoW, especially in the classic era versions of them. Not even a few minutes into a fight and you can have casters struggling to do their rotation simply because they lost all their mana in the time frame. Thankfully, Life Tap remedies this issue at the cost of their HP, restoring a chunk of their mana for it. So long as you're able to heal yourself or have a healer take care of you, you would literally never run out of mana as a Warlock because of the potential infinite amount of times you could use this ability. All you need is a good chunk of health and you'll be back into the fight doing your rotation with no need to sink and drink mana. It's actually the main hero power for the Warlock class in Hearthstone, costing health at the benefit of drawing a card forth. It literally is used in every aspect of the Warlock class because mana is a universal amongst it. It literally is the epitome of a Warlock class fantasy to injure themselves for a quick boost of power, only to have them heal off the damage later on, constantly dishing out damage to their enemies either way. It wasn't until BFA that this ability was removed, because at this point Blizzard had moved away from the idea of managing mana as a DPS class, as it could be generally unfun to have to just watch a bar very slowly rise because you went all out in your opener. Warlocks were included in this ratio of classes for a time, and the most Life Tap saw in the more retail versions of WoW expansions was during Legion, where pressing Life Tap would actually start to garner a damage increase because of a buff it left for the player from the talent choice. But because it doesn't actually do damage and just forces you to occasionally press a random button, it was removed for generally being unfun, and Blizzard hasn't made any note on whether this iconic ability will ever return for the infinite mana pot Warlock enjoyers. At least healers will be happier knowing their Warlocks aren't any themselves as often. And at number 4, we have Fel and Demon Armor spells. These spells were a passive buff to give to yourself from the very start of Warlock's character's journey. Applying them would give you a flat increase to your armor and increase the amount of health generated through spells like Drain Life by 20%. This was the case for Demon Armor, and it was the default option for all Warlocks, and just naturally made them tankier for having it. It also just basically gave you a flat 20% increased healing buff, so in fights where you may perform the Forbidden Warlock tank gimmick, you could restore more health to actually out-heal the damage of certain mechanics. At level 62 in the Burning Crusade expansion, this armor ability was often forgotten and left behind for its improved version, Fel Armor. This one would also increase the effectiveness of healing spells by 20%, but it also increased your spell damage by a large amount. So not only do you get the precious effects from before, but now you do even more damage alongside it. It may have not done much, but in an era of buffs being of great importance, it really helps give Warlocks a bit more flavor that makes them more unique to others. The idea of warding themselves with the Demon Scales or the magic of Fel is pretty on point, and a free increase to your damage and healing is also nice. It's just kind of annoying to reapply the buff if you happen to die, and while that does suck, this buff does really help the opposite from happening, since it buffs your healing and all that. It actually is interesting to see the Warlocks become actual tanks in Season of Discovery version of World of Warcraft. This is thanks to a multitude of other buffs and class changes to make it possible, but this armor buff can be seen as the godfather that started it all. Without the meme of the Warlock tanks, we may have never become a true thing. And at number 3, we have the Grimoire of Supremacy, or otherwise known as Demonic Servitude. This talent was added in Warlords of Draenor as a level 100 selection node from the Mist of Pandaria version of talents. Basically, what it does is make either your Infernal or Doomguard summon permanent. Normally, these buttons were on a really long cooldown and were intended to be used only once per fight. But now, you could literally keep them constantly by your side, and even order how they use their mechanics like you would any other demon of the Legion. If you wanted heavier AoE or tankiness, you could have a massive Infernal by your side that could rip packs apart literally for just existing in your presence. The Doomguard was a solid single target choice because of its Deathbolt cast, dealing even more damage when a boss hit 20% or lower health, or otherwise known as the Execute range. It actually was so strong in Legion raids that Blizzard had to reduce its damage by a whole 20% to bring them more in line with the DPS of the other classes. It was just super entertaining in both the comedic and awesome sense to see a Warlock's massive pet lumber forward and do a bunch of their damage and then walk back like nothing happened. It actually was kind of annoying in WoD itself because the Infernal was quite large and could block someone's view of mechanics on the floor when you were condensed into a small encounter zone like the Grimoire Depot dungeon. You can actually still summon an Infernal demon as a Destruction Warlock in retail, but this is on a 3-minute cooldown before the consideration of talents, and sadly is for a much more limited time than its literal infinite duration before. The Doomguard can technically still be summoned by a Warlock, but this is only from the Ritual of Doom, where 4 members of your party will channel into a pillar and randomly kill one of them. The Warlock must then enslave the demon and can use them for almost the same amount of time as Grimoire Supremacy would have allowed them, but this is rarely seen in any instance of content because it never really does at a DPS, and no one wants to get themselves killed for a Warlock's loss in damage. Either way, it was super fun to command such normally very powerful demons at will and see the havoc they wrought. And at number 2 of Warlock abilities, we have Burning Embers. This ability was a passive given to Destruction of Warlocks in the Mist of Pandaria expansion, and was meant to be replacement of the normally used Soul Shards. A Warlock could have 4 Embers at a time, and these Embers could be spent with Chaos Bolt for massive DPS, or Ember Tap to heal yourself instead. To generate these Embers, you would use the Immolate, Incinerate, and Shadowburn spells, each giving you a partial Ember that eventually would fill the bar completely to spend as needed. Though Shadowburn only really gave you Embers if it actually killed something, so your main 2 were Immolate and Incinerate. This rework of Destruction was intended to compensate for the loss of the original talent trees like mentioned before, and it completely changed the game for this specialization. When you start to combine things like their Mastery Emberstorm, the Searing Flames talent, and the Glyph of Ember Tap, you can start to see how tanky a Warlock can become. In PvP, this especially made them hard to kill, as they could almost never die so long as they continue to generate the Embers from their basic filler spells. You also had access to the Flames of Zoroth, which would instantly revive your demon for 1 burning Ember. You also had the Fire and Brimstone talent, which allowed you to spend an Ember to allow you to hit every single target in a group with something like Immolate and Incinerate. If there were enough targets, you could almost immediately gain the Ember you just spent back, and then continue to crank out really efficient damage. And as we've learned, being uncapped in AoE makes you one of the best classes at a given time depending on the rules of the other classes. Basically, if you hit a Warlock with anything, they have an answer for it thanks to the system. And if you left them alone, they could send very heavy Chaos Bolts at you or the boss and just climb the DPS meters. After all, living a difficult boss fight is better than dying early and then nothing happens because your burst is over. The true sustained burning Embers allowed was really novel and interesting at the same time, and helped shift Destruction into what it is now. It plays very similarly to the Burning Embers, but instead reverts back to the original Soul Shards, and you can no longer heal with things like Ember Tap. So they're a lot less tanky, but such is the price for being a Warlock. You always seem to have too much power, and Blizzard just has to flat out remove abilities in order to bring you down to the level of the others, unfortunately. Thankfully, they're still really fun to play. And completing our list at number 1, we have Metamorphosis, something that pretty much any longtime Warlock fan was expecting to see here. This ability was added in Wrath of the Lich King and was the final capstone of the Demonology Warlock tree. Using it would transform your character into a demon itself to really sell the theme of summoning demons in full. Doing so will grant the Warlock various other spells to use that all deal heavy amounts of damage and increase the damage of the Warlock themselves in the process. It also makes them insanely tanky, able to eat the damage of abilities they otherwise never would have been able to while the form persists. The abilities it would grant often enhance the DPS throughout a Warlock significantly in AoE damage, and if you saw a pack absolutely get melted and a Warlock has top DPS, you definitely could look over and see a large demon walking around your party responsible for it. This was in large part thanks to the Immolation aura, which just by default did large amounts of AoE damage, but also required you to press it once and then stand near enemies. It's like if Hellfire didn't have any of its marked downsides and did more damage than it used to do basically, and you could use both at the same time. You also get Demonic Leap, which would help you charge forward and stun enemies so you have an easier time of getting into melee range. Touch of Chaos allows you to just do damage at will and extend the duration of your currently existing corruption cast, allowing for less button pressing. Chaos Wave would enhance your Hand of Gul'dan into something much stronger and reduce the movement speed of enemies hit by 50%. These abilities were introduced more so in Mist of Pandaria, where you would use spenders similar to the Embers in a way called Demonic Fury. Most of your abilities as a Demo Lock would generate the spender, and then you would spend them as necessary for your abilities, and Metamorphosis would make them do much more damage in the process. You also had Karen Swarm, which technically doesn't need you to be Metamorphosis, but did require you to talent it. Basically, it worked like an Evoker's wing buffer that we know today, and would flap your wings forward to knock back enemies in a frontal cone, but also dealt damage to the targets within. Even if they could immune the knockback, it would also interrupt their casts as one of the few AoE interrupts that actually existed in the game. All of these spells were directly tied to Metamorphosis, and was the absolute peak of Warlock class fantasy back in the day. It just felt great to plan your cooldown setup around the usage of this button, and then leap in to deal huge amounts of damage and tank mechanics that you shouldn't have stood in, but you did anyway because you could. With things like Live Metamorphosis, you could even increase the amount of time you were in this form to get a second cast of its most important spell, Immolation Aura. Even if it only lasted a short amount of time, its few extra seconds of damage was almost always worth it in the end of a fight. It even got a makeover in Mist of Pandaria if you completed the famous Greenfire questline, which was made specifically for Warlocks at the time. Completed it would not only grant your fire spells a much more fel appearance, as people have come to learn, but it also made your Metamorphosis form green instead of purple. Thematically, it just looks great, even for the fact that it was added in Wrath of the Lich King, a time where minigames were still getting to the threshold of graphics we've come to understand today. Unfortunately, this ability was removed in Legion to make room for the Demon Hunter class instead, who got an ability of the same name. If you look at Demon Hunters as a whole, you can actually see they pulled a decent chunk of their abilities from the original meta form to be placed into their class kit, such as the very powerful Immolation Aura itself. We never got to see this popular ability ever return, unfortunately, in its former glory, but ironically, Destruction and Affliction Warlocks will see a semi-return of Metamorphosis in the War Within hero talents via the Malevolence button in the Hellcaller talent tree. It's a much lesser version of the demonic self you may have once known, but it still lets you appear more like your actual character and gives you those iconic horns and colors all the same. So it's still nice to see around, even if only somewhat. Alright, and that's the list. Are there any other Warlock abilities that were removed that we may have missed, or have any ideas for future videos just like this one? If so, let us know down in the comments below.